Hello and welcome to Paincast, conversations on pain and physiotherapy. This podcast is brought to you by the Pain Science Division of the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. I'm Raina, a physiotherapy student at the University of British Columbia.
I'm Tiffany, a physiotherapy student at the University of Toronto. We'll be your hosts for today's episode.
Today we are joined by Arthur Woznowski-Vu. He is a licensed physiotherapist, PhD candidate, proud dad, husband, and lifelong artist from Montreal. After a few years of clinical practice and several professional development courses, he became very interested in understanding pain according to the latest science for the benefit of enhancing his effectiveness as a physio to help people living with pain. This led Arthur to pursue a PhD in rehabilitation science at McGill University, and he is now in his final year. He has also done some teaching at the university level. At the Canadian Physiotherapy Association, Arthur has been the chair of the Pain Science Division since 2021, and he is currently in the process of launching his own chronic pain rehab clinic.
In this episode, we get into Arthur's work in pain science research and advocacy at the Pain Science Division, the value of the Pain Science Division, and the importance of integrating pain science with physiotherapy practice. Enjoy!
Hi, Arthur. How are you doing?
Good. Happy to be here. How are you guys doing?
Doing great.
I'm doing great, thank you. Yeah, I want to thank you for speaking with us today. Tiffany and I are very excited to chat with you, and I'm sure your insights will provide a lot of value to our audience as well. So to start off, can you tell us about your area of practice in physiotherapy and research and how you got here?
Yeah, let me kind of backtrack a little bit. I graduated from McGill in 2013. And that same year at the Canadian Physiotherapy Association's annual congress, one of the plenary speakers was actually Dr. Lorimer Mosley. And that was a pretty influential moment for me. This plenary speech really kind of caught my attention in terms of how pain is so ubiquitous in everything that we do in physiotherapy. Well, maybe not everything, but very close to. And how fascinating it is as a concept. Of course, it's not so fascinating when you're living it, but from an outside perspective, as someone who is just kind of getting into the world of physical rehabilitation, therapy, this was something that I found super interesting. And I mean, one of the things that really kind of caught my attention was hurt doesn't equal harm, right? Where you could have pain, and it may or may not be perfectly related to how much tissue damage there is. In fact, there could be pain even without tissue damage. And we can get into that later if that interests you. But that started really opening my eyes to the science of pain and really trying to see that there could be a lot of value in getting better at looking at the most up-to-date pain science and trying to implement it in everyday clinical practice. And so that's what I started trying to do as I was working in with practice and just kind of seeing all sorts of cases as one does in a private practice, just in the community, and try to, take some weekend courses and other professional development opportunities to gather more expertise in pain science, in treating pain that is a little bit more complex or more persistent pain cases. And ultimately, as you said in the intro, it led me to start doing a PhD and getting more deeply involved. But even before that, what the Pain Science Division offered for the first time in 2015 was a mentorship program. And as a young clinician, just a couple of years into the workforce, a mentorship program felt very appealing because you can take courses, you can gather a bunch of knowledge, but it seems like there's always this gap between this kind of theoretical knowledge and then actually applying it in practice. And so I found the mentorship program to be super helpful in terms of developing my clinical reasoning, talking over challenging cases, but especially really kind of bridging that gap between, okay, now I've learned all these things on courses, but how do I really implement that in my day-to-day practice? And in a way that kind of got me involved with the Pain Science Division for the very first time and kind of got roped into some volunteer roles. And we can get into that a little bit later on if you want more details. But it so happened that from that first involvement in 2015, right now I'm the chair of the pain science division. So it's been a nice journey.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Although you're a lot farther along in your journey with regards to involvement in pain science, I can really relate to that initial fascination of, expanding beyond looking at pain from, I guess, a biomedical lens and seeing it more holistically, and then wanting to look into it more through various facets. So that's really interesting to hear. I'm also curious because, you're a clinician and a researcher. So I'm wondering how being both a clinician and a researcher has influenced your client care over the years.
I think I wouldn't be the only one to say it, but I feel that there's a lot of benefit in getting involved in both areas. Now, it's not for everyone to do necessarily, but you can do it to different extents. I did it in a relatively formal fashion in terms of actually pursuing graduate studies, but you could also do it through other types of involvement. But what I find very valuable is that sometimes, in some cases, clinical practice is not informed by evidence as much as it could be. And I feel that when you're involved with research, that's one way that you can really up to date with the latest evidence and research and thinking already about trying to implement that in your clinical practice and be as evidence informed as you can with the most current evidence. Now, you can also do that just by having a kind of disciplined involvement in keeping up with the literature or taking courses. So this is kind of one way of doing it, but it's a bit more of a in-depth way of doing it, since you really kind of get intimately familiar with the research process and it helps you kind of interpret the evidence. And on the flip side, research sometimes can be perceived as being quite distant from the day-to-day reality that clinicians have in clinical practice. And by remaining involved as a clinician, I think that there's a huge benefit in really anchoring your perspective as a researcher in ways that take into consideration, okay, well, how does it actually connect to the day-to-day reality of clinical practice? So it really forces you to be engaged in one world while having the lenses of another world at the same time and really being involved with that. And being a clinician scientist, it's something that I really believe in a lot. And in 2018, I did a panel discussion about it at CPA Congress, which a couple of years later followed up with a publication, an editorial in Physiotherapy Canada with co-authors Dr. Patrick Purcell and Dr. Anne Hudon, who are also physiotherapists, PhDs. And we talked about in that editorial about more in depth about what we feel are the strengths and values of being involved in both worlds. So if you're interested, you can definitely look that up. So it's an editorial in Physiotherapy Canada. And so if you just look up like clinician scientists, it's going to come up.
Okay, wonderful. I'm wondering on a practical level how your client care has changed since you sort of became more interested in pursuing research, and do you have any sort of practical examples of how you might approach pain differently now given that experience?
Sure, yeah. I think what's nice to appreciate when you get involved in research is how things are not black and white and how things are very nuanced, how there's a lot of individual variability. Start thinking about, not so much about a specific number, but you start thinking about ranges and, standard deviations and all this kind of wiggle room that exists and all this potential for error when you interpret things. And so it really kind of forces you to have a much more kind of nuanced, flexible way of thinking about the evidence and how to implement it in practice, so that you don't think about it as, oh, this paper said that, therefore this is the right answer, and you just kind of follow that with maybe not enough kind of critical thought and integration. In a way, it kind of lends more space for, clinical experience and patient preferences and the other factors you take into account, so that you can better shape what you can gather from the evidence. So I think that's one major strength that I got out of being involved in research, because as a fresh out of school PT, it was very tempting, very attractive to try to find these courses or that really give you this complete certainty about this is the way to do it, this is the way to look at it, and then there's like no nuance, which can be very seductive because it fills you with confidence that, oh yeah, this is the way it is, and there isn't like maybe a few different ways to look at it, and all this kind of case by case and individual variability and all that messy stuff. So I think that's kind of one thing that I highlight, and of course there's other things that people can talk about. You know, it makes it easier to interpret and keep up with the literature, and being a current clinician from an evidence standpoint also helps you to be a lot more comfortable with test and retest and outcome measures and all that stuff, which is quite prevalent in research. So yeah, so those are some of the things I'd highlight.
Right. So I guess it's kind of made you a more flexible clinician in the sense of it allows you to take in all of this information you gain from research and all of the reading you do related to your areas of interest, but then you also have, you know, a better ability to see people, individuals, and be a little bit more flexible in how you approach their care.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the
Yeah,
main
absolutely.
gist
And what's also something that struck me when I got more involved in research is that in the clinical world, we sometimes get somewhat, for lack of a better term, somewhat territorial about this is physiotherapy versus this is this other profession versus this is other profession. But when you go in research, a lot of these kind of like ideas about professions, you know, those boundaries kind of blur because the focus is more about what's the intervention or what's the phenomenon that you're trying to evaluate. And so now you're not thinking so much about from one profession to another, but you're really just thinking about the patient and what could help them. And I feel that kind of mindset is also very helpful to adopt.
Right. That's very interesting. I also wanted to circle back to your role on the pain science division of the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. So I'm curious to hear more about what brought you to the pain science division and why you're passionate about your current role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I alluded to earlier, you know, there was a plenary talk in 2013 from Dr. Lermer Mosley. There was my initial involvement a couple of years later with the mentorship program at the pain science division. And those were kind of like the first hooks that really kind of got me hooked on pain science. But I think what really kind of got me interested in being involved, on the one hand, you can think about it in a way that's maybe not only tied to the pain science division, but maybe just to like any volunteer involvement, let's say in the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. And it's this idea that when you get involved, you can play a pretty big part, a pretty influential part in how the profession is evolving, and within something like the pain science division, within the practice area that's interesting for you. And so you really get into these really interesting leadership opportunities that can really shape where the profession is going. And so if you are in a situation where, you know, maybe you got into physiotherapy having a certain vision or idea of what physiotherapy should be, then once you actually started working or even when you're still at school, maybe you were faced with certain situations that made you realize a discrepancy between what your vision or your ideal of what physiotherapy is. Well, when you get involved and you get into these kind of leadership positions as a volunteer at the Canadian Physiotherapy Association, or within your own practice area specifically, like the pain science division, well, in these leadership positions, you now have the opportunity to start closing that discrepancy between reality and what your vision for reality was for the profession and your practice area. And so there's this wonderful opportunities to be involved with that. Also from a standpoint, and this is kind of really the same thing, advocacy. So you can really get involved in some important advocacy efforts. For example, right now in my role as chair of the pain science division, I'm also involved in a working group that gathers together other chairs from other divisions, so other practice areas, as well as the staff from the Canadian Physiotherapy Association, as well as other members of the pain science division. And together as a working group that I'm leading, where we have a national advocacy campaign that we're launching to really promote the value of physiotherapy in relation to pain care. And specifically between 2019 and 2021, was the Canadian Pain Task Force, which was a federally mandated task force in response to the opioid crisis and illicit opioids. and they produced 3 reports, with the last report being a set of recommendations and an action plan for pain in Canada. And so you have these recommendations from the Canadian Pain Task Force report, and at the Canadian Physiotherapy Association, and in my role as chair of the Pain Science Division, we decided to go ahead and step up and say, okay, you're identifying all these gaps in pain care in Canada, you're making all these recommendations. Well, us physiotherapists are very important key players in co-leading with other health professionals the response to these recommendations, the implementation of these recommendations. And so by getting involved, there's this opportunity to do this national advocacy effort to really raise the profile of physiotherapy in a way that aligns with what I think is a strength in physiotherapy. And in terms of just kind of more broadly, other people and just kind of joining the Pain Science Division, it's only $35 per year to be part of the Pain Science Division. And when we think about advocacy efforts like the one that I just mentioned, the more people that you represent, the more members you have behind the message, the stronger the message is, and the more impact it makes when you're starting to promote this message to Health Canada or members of Parliament or the government, MPs or whoever else as a stakeholder or decision maker. It carries more weight to have more people. So to get back to kind of your original question about what inspired me to be part of the Pain Science Division, well, as we know, when we think about our provincial regulatory bodies, our physio colleges, or in Quebec, the Ordre professionnel des physiothérapeutes, their mandate is the protection of the public. They're not there for us, they're there for the public. Whereas professional associations like the Canadian Physiotherapy Association and its provincial branches or the special interest divisions, their mandate, our mandate, is to serve you, the physiotherapists, in helping you in any way that we can, be it advocacy to really kind of raise the profile of the profession a certain way, be it in terms of helping you keep up with your continuing education and having professional development programs like mentor programs and so forth. So if you want to be helpful with the advocacy effort just by being an extra number in the number of members, you're already making a big difference in helping move the profession forward. And then if you decide to get more involved, that's totally up to you. But these are the kind of things that really motivate me. At first, I wasn't even sure if I was going to get involved, but I just wanted to contribute an extra number in terms of a paying member behind any advocacy effort that would happen.
Yeah, so it seems like being a part of the Pain Science Division is really a key way to make change in the field. And I think that's really exciting for myself and probably Tiffany as well, because being a part of the student committee has been sort of like a stepping stone towards the Pain Science Division. So that's exciting to hear that there's all of these opportunities.
Yeah, so I've been talking for a while. I'm curious to kind of flip this on the two of you. Can you tell me a little bit about what got you interested in getting involved, and you can talk a little bit about the student committee at the Pain Science Division?
Sure. Yeah, I can start by describing our roles on the student committee, and then maybe we can get into what brought us there in the first place. So basically, Tiffany and I work together to lead various projects on the Pain Science Division Student Committee, and we work with other committee members who are also other students, physiotherapy students across Canada, to make these projects happen. So the Paincast is one of them, which is what we're doing now. And we also have been organizing a student forum, which will happen in mid-May of this year. So the student forum will provide other physio students and new grads, among others who are interested, basically with a chance to hear from various experts in pain science and what their careers in pain science have looked like. And and then the student committee also meets to discuss various pain-related case studies from real client encounters. So it's been a great experience so far. And then in terms of why I got interested in this in the first place, well, I sort of came to the realization that I'm really interested in pain science because working with clients to manage their pain is a key role that physiotherapists play on an everyday basis. So it really takes up a lot of our work. That's a big reason why people come to see us, is to help them manage their pain. But at the same time, the experience of pain is extremely complex and individualized. So I wanted to take a deeper dive into understanding how to approach complex pain and learn more about pain in general, as well as connect with others who are like-minded. And the Pain Science Division Student Committee was one way I could do this. And then from there as well, I also wanted to mention that my undergrad is a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. So I came into the physio program at UBC with a somewhat holistic mindset when it comes to health and well-being. And so I'm quite interested in taking on a more biopsychosocial approach to pain and client care in general. And I think that really aligns with pain science and the work that's done at the Pain Science Division. Yeah, and then I'll also pass the mic on to Tiffany so she can share why she became interested as well.
Yeah, I started this physio program and I saw the opportunity to participate in pain science division and I immediately got really interested in it because wanting to be a physio, I know and I have experience with being, for example, a physiotherapy assistant that people usually come to see us because they have, some sort of pain. And I have friends with pain in different areas, joint pain or pain from injury. And I know from my own experience as well that pain has a lot of effect on our lives, in not only physically, but also mentally and socially and energy and all of that. So I think being able to more effectively address patients' pain concern means a lot to our patients, and that will even improve their quality of life. And that's why I'm very interested in getting involved in the pain science division and being a part of the force of advancing our practice and understanding of pain so we can better serve our patients. And very similar to what Arthur, your passion and your excitement about the potential when you get involved as the chair of the Pain Science Division. I share the same excitement as a co-chair of the Student Association, being able to facilitate and drive conversations about pain and physiotherapy, just among students. So these students, when they graduate to become physiotherapists, have more nuanced, more well-rounded, holistic understanding of how can we work with patients in pain. And Paincast, what we're doing right now, is definitely one of the very passionate project I have to drive these conversations. And as you say, a lot of us, maybe we will have one sort of mindset of how pain works and how we should approach pain and treatment a certain way, but there are also many different thoughts and many different philosophies. So I am quite interested in featuring these on the podcast and just really advocate for our patients. Yeah, so we've talked a lot about our passions and the excitement we have when it comes to the potential of participating in the Pain Science Division. I'm interested in learning a little more about the Pain Science Division itself. And Arthur, you'd be great to, inform our audience, like, what is this division about? Why would people should really want to get involved?
Absolutely. It'd be my pleasure. And so thanks, Reina and Tiffany, for sharing your passion for the area of pain in physiotherapy and for being involved with the Pain Science Division. That was really great to hear. I mean, this is something that I think the three of us could keep going and going, talking about how we're passionate about this topic. I mean, one of the things that I find is just so interesting is that pain is probably one of the most difficult topics to explore, one of the most complex, very individual experiences phenomenons to explore. And pain is such a fundamental part of the human experience, regardless of whether you are currently a patient or just not a patient going by through life. I mean, pain is inevitable, and so it's such a fascinating thing to explore. Now, about the Pain Science Division, it kind of came in part out of this recognition of how complex pain is, how it's one of the most complex phenomena. Yet it's so widespread and almost inevitable as part of your role as a physiotherapist. And so it's not just about thinking about pain in terms of chronic or persistent pain, although that is a big part of it, and considering the unique considerations of conditions like fibromyalgia or complex regional pain syndrome, for example, that does require a specific content expertise, and that has definitely been one of the drivers for forming the pain science division. But it's bigger than that. It's also about having a deeper understanding of pain and the complexities of pain, as Reina was highlighting the biopsychosocial model, and how there is this recognition that body and mind are not separate. They're inextricably intertwined with one another and always present together, although maybe in different ways, in different proportions. And so to help people better understand and manage pain in all its complexity, regardless of whether it's chronic or not, but especially, of course, in chronic and persistent pain conditions. In 2008, a long-term effort towards creating the division came to fruition. And in 2008, the Pain Science Division was formed, the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. And for those who are not familiar with the terminology at the Canadian Physiotherapy Association, divisions are the word they use for special interest groups. And so the Pain Science Division was formed then, founding chair being Neil Pearson. And then since 2008, the Pain Science Division has existed, as I said, to really serve physiotherapists, to support physiotherapists and advocate for them in the area of pain and trying to better understand and manage pain, but also to facilitate networking and connection with other like-minded clinicians, educators, and researchers that have the same interest at the intersection of physiotherapy and pain, but as well to really facilitate the bidirectional translation of knowledge between pain research and clinical practice. And that kind of alludes to what I was talking about earlier, how both research and practice benefit from one another and could be better integrated in both directions. And so the idea, the vision behind the Pain Science Division, since it was formed and it continues to be the same vision, is to really support physiotherapists to help Canadians with pain to live better with the help of physiotherapy. And there's a whole range of activities that we have at the Pain Science Division, a lot of things that we do to achieve these goals. We talked about the advocacy efforts that exist and how members can choose to be involved either actively or just by being a member and boosting our numbers. But it's also in terms of, for example, this podcast or our pain casts, or we have webinars or courses. For example, March 25th, 26th in Ottawa, there's a course, an in-person course that is being launched as a collaboration between the orthopedic division and the pain science division to really integrate pain science into your typical ortho practice. And although there might be a chance that this will be converted into an online course. Or another webinar that we're offering in April 13th, we have a panel of experts that are going to make a series of presentations and open up for discussion about what every physiotherapist needs to know about opioids. And so you can register through through Embodia, or with the way that Embodia is linked with the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. If you're one of our members, you would have seen it in our recent email, or you could see it also in our social media. And then that's March, that's April, boom, May 18th, what do we have? The Pain Science Division Student Forum that was mentioned earlier. And so there's all these offerings that are sometimes more like a traditional course where you're learning, towards more discussion and debate, towards more kind of also facilitating career path decisions like the Student Forum, and kind of shining a light on all these different things that are interesting. And so there's that. We have the mentorship program, which I mentioned. We have throughout the country these journal clubs that are called Pain Science to Practice discussion groups. Although they're clinically oriented, the focus of discussing journal articles is about how to implement them in practice. We have a lot going on in terms of our website, for instance, that we're doing a lot of efforts towards making it a lot more user-friendly, a lot more effective. So trying to use some knowledge translation science to really take our website to the next level. And we want to create opportunities to support our community and to recognize them. And so from the world of research, we have a pain science research grant that comes out every second year. There's one right now that's active. There's a clinical specialty program that's administered through the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. And we have in the past and want to continue recognizing our members for their achievements. So I guess to recap, because I've been kind of listing a lot of things now. It's to help you with your education, staying connected, having a community, and to help to move the profession forward in this area of practice.
Wow, yeah, the pain science division is really doing a lot. And audience, if you're a physio or physio student and not involved in pain science division yet, I think it's really worthwhile to get involved.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. And if you want to kind of get a taste of what's out there, there's a few things that you can access that even if you're not a member yet. For example, painscience.ca is a self-administered professional development tool that we created. You go on the website, you fill out a questionnaire that helps you identify where are your gaps in knowledge in terms of the area of pain and physiotherapy. And then once you've identified your gaps in knowledge on this website, again, it's painscience.ca, you have a list of resources so that you can fill that gap in terms of either reading articles or webinars or courses or what you like. And then there's also Paincast, which just very recently is now on Spotify. So, which really kudos to Tiffany and Rain for doing that. So if you're not yet a member and you want to get a taste of what we have to offer, these are things that I encourage you to check out. And then if you do become a member, then there's a lot more you can even access.
This gets me really excited about, again, the potential of what pain science division can do in serving physiotherapists, but also the broader community. I'm curious about Arthur. I know you won't be the chair next year, but being the chair right now and pushing these resources and advocacies and educational opportunities for our physiotherapy community, what is your vision of pain science division in the next 5 to 10 years? Like, what would you want pain science division to be at? What would you want to be like by then?
That's a good question. I mean, at a micro level, we're hoping to continue to showcase our strengths, but also to polish off the things that are not working as well as we'd like them to. So there's been a long-standing effort towards improving our website and how easy it is to be aware and remember everything that we have to offer and to engage with it with your day-to-day practice and staying up to date. So there's all these things that we're working towards improving, but that's kind of like at the micro level. And of course, all the things that I've already mentioned in terms of our offerings. But you think of it maybe more at a macro level. And this is something where I'm going to borrow or be inspired by one of the past chairs that was here at the Pain Science Division before me. So one of the past chairs, Janet Hawley, we had some nice discussions about the kind of long-term vision for the Pain Science Division. And we felt that an interesting way that you could consider the Pain Science Division to be successful, if it reaches a point where everything that we're advocating for in terms of the biopsychosocial model of pain, the inextricable link between psychology and biology and all the most up-to-date pain science knowledge, well, if it can be really well integrated into all the areas of practice and into all the other divisions, then we jokingly said that the Pain Science Division would achieve its mission, its vision, if it becomes obsolete, because everyone would have integrated all this pain science knowledge into all their areas of practice completely. Now, of course, there's still many reasons for us to remain alive and the opposite of obsolete, because knowledge is always evolving, and there are some topics that are very unique to pain science. If we consider, for example, different chronic pain conditions, but that's kind of one way where we thought that the vision, the big success of pain science really lies in the collaboration and integration across all practice areas in physiotherapy.
Right. Yeah, it is a macro level vision that, one day if we can integrate this understanding of pain science among the physiotherapy community such that every physio can very effectively help patients manage their pain, that would be a very eschatological vision that the Pain Science Division would have. Having that in mind, what are some unique challenges as of the pain science division right now that you are, for example, encountering or seeing as you're leading the pain science division that would be barriers to achieving the micro level goals that you mentioned and also this macro level goal?
I think in large part, one of the main challenges of the pain science division is for people to really understand what we're about. And the reason why I list it as a challenge is because it requires a little bit of explanation. It requires a little bit of nuance to really think about why is it important to have a dedicated special interest group that looks into the science of pain and complex pain conditions. It's been sometimes, for instance, questioned, well, isn't pain already covered as part of, for example, the orthopedic division's curriculum and the content that they cover? And so I think the main challenge in the pain science division is for people to shake any misconceptions about what pain science is. Sometimes some of the misconceptions are that you practice in this kind of traditional biomedical way, and then when it doesn't work or you hit a wall, then you switch to the biopsychosocial model, right? And then you integrate that. But that's a huge misconception, because you should be practicing like that from the get-go and not further down the line. And sometimes the misconception that pain science is this completely other thing and that we're maybe excessively involved in psychology or whatever, but it isn't, right? That the whole idea of pain science is to take what you're already doing, the solid, tried and true practice principles and knowledge of physiotherapy, and to build that, to expand on that, with the recognition that even though we are physical therapists, you cannot remove the psychology from the person in front of you when you're going through your interaction. So it's about having a level of knowledge that allows you to take that into account without necessarily being or pretending to be a psychologist. That's kind of one example. So pain science is relevant from the start and not just later on. Pain science is about building on what you already know, not about completely changing what you're doing. And so our challenges sometimes are fighting these misconceptions about what we are and fighting misconceptions about why is it that we need to exist and how we are distinguished from other divisions. And so we have been, since the start, been doing a lot of efforts towards clarifying this identity and this branding and clarifying these misconceptions. But I think it remains a challenge. It remains a challenge, especially in a society where we sometimes just read the headline or just take 2 seconds to make a judgment about something, when that something in particular might be a little bit more nuanced and requires you to go a little bit deeper to really appreciate what it is and what its value is. So I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. I'm hearing also your personal vision on how physiotherapists can approach pain science. That this is not something that you incorporate later on when the biomedical model doesn't work. It's something that you want to implement on the get-go. Even though pain science divisions is pain science, but it's also very much an art, how physios can incorporate this every single moment of their practice. Can you elaborate a little more on what does that look like? And for example, for an ideal physiotherapist to be able to do that, what do they do on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways to answer this question. One of the ways that you can answer this question is to start thinking about what I mentioned earlier, that hurt doesn't necessarily equal harm, that there can be a divergence from pain versus injury. And so when you're thinking about traditional biomedical model, you have certain expectations about if you have a certain type of injury of a certain level of severity, and then you have certain expectations for tissue healing, of how slow or how fast the tissue healing is, and how much pain you'd expect to have. But we know that pain is not this direct measure of how much tissue damage is. It can be very closely correlated in some cases, but in some cases, you can really start to see that the amount of tissue damage and how much pain there is might be only somewhat correlated and not perfectly correlated. Now, this is obviously different from case to case, but starting to recognize when pain and the disability associated with pain start to go in a direction that is different than you'd expect from a traditional biomedical view of tissue damage and repair. And so I think that that's a really important thing to consider, because if you are diverging from this, how much pain or how much time it takes to recover based on this traditional biomedical model of tissue injury, that means that there's other stuff going on, and to a different extent for different people. You can think about genetics, of course, but you can also think about sensory sensitization factors, where you start to develop sensitization in relation to things that your body perceives as threatening. And so you can have quite a bit of pain with things that aren't necessarily causing tissue damage. You could have some psychological factors that are really important to consider, be it catastrophizing or fear, and that can really amplify any existing pain that you have, or it can really kind of explain why you have this amount of activity limitations or participation restrictions, even though you have this amount of tissue damage, and you'd expect that over this timeline, the pain instability would have resolved. And so you start kind of with that recognition, that understanding, and from there, what can be a really good way of approaching it is to think of the difference between screening and assessment, and then doing risk stratified management. And so when you're thinking about the biopsychosocial model, it's good to have a strategy so that in your evaluation, you kind of screen across all the areas of the biopsychosocial model to see if there's anything that could be relevant, screening about support from others, thoughts and feelings, understanding of pain, how they're coping with pain, how it's affecting their activities. And you just kind of do some screening that way. And when you pick up some signals that, hey, there seems to be something going on here, then you take a deeper dive with an actual assessment, something that goes deeper than a screening. Maybe as you screen all these different things, you identify that, hey, it sounds like there might be some excessively negative perceptions about their pain, or their mind seems to be really stuck on it. Okay, now you've got your clue to do an assessment. And so you go and you administer the pain catastrophizing scale, for instance. And then as you're doing that, it's about identifying from a biopsychosocial standpoint, what is your biggest barrier? What is your biggest ball and chain that is preventing you from moving forward? Because if you don't take the time to identify what seems to be the biggest barrier, you might be doing everything perfectly, yet see very little or limited improvement in the person's pain and disability, because there's an important barrier that first needs to be tackled before moving forward with the rest. And so you can do this kind of risk stratified management, where you try to find people where you try to determine if people are kind of low risk, don't have any of these big barriers, and you can do it in the more traditional kind of ortho way. Or if you're identifying that there are one or two barriers or many barriers, and say there's higher levels of risk, and so you need to adapt the approach to either be targeting the sensitization processes or to target the psychological or social barriers. And so it's really thinking about all this complexity from the get-go, recognizing that stuff like sensitization can happen within a week. It doesn't have to happen after 3 months, like the chronic pain definition. And to recognize that if you do that, you could prevent the development of chronic pain, or when there is chronic pain, to better manage it.
Right. So it sounds like a key part of the biopsychosocial approach to managing pain and client care is to first always be on the lookout for signs of central sensitization and things like that. And then once you sort of become suspicious that other things are going on, having some clear strategies to investigate this further. And I want to circle back to talking more about your research as well. I want to take a deeper dive into that because I know your PhD is coming to an end. You've almost finished that journey. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about your research and where you're headed.
So this kind of builds nicely on what I just talked about. As physiotherapists, one of our main treatment tools is to prescribe physical activity and exercise as part of someone's physical rehabilitation and as a non-pharmacological pain management strategy. But when you consider the research and the reality of it, you only tend to take advantage of the therapeutic effect of rehabilitative physical activity or exercise if the person adheres to the recommendations consistently and for a long enough period of time, so that after a sufficient number of weeks or months, you build the benefit of exercise, physical activity on pain and disability, quality of life, and so forth. So one of our main interventions in physiotherapy depends on those conditions. Yet, for a lot of people with pain, as soon as they start to move, as soon as they start to engage with a physical activity, they can have these immediate increases in pain, or they can have these immediate reactions in terms of negative thoughts and feelings, or in terms of kind of like their sensory sensitization, it can start having reactions right away. And so these immediate sensitized reactions to physical activity is the topic of my PhD. I'm looking at sensitivity to physical activity, trying to better understand it. What are the underlying processes of it? What is the prognostic value of assessing that, and how can it guide and inform treatment, kind of in this like risk stratified way that I mentioned earlier, and also to try to better standardize this kind of evaluation, because right now a lot of physiotherapists are likely thinking about the kind of immediate pain reactions and other reactions that people have when they try to do a physical activity. But for the purpose of having better prognostic value, there is value in making it more standardized and robust as a approach to assessing sensitivity to physical activity, and thinking not just about kind of long-term outcomes like pain and disability 3 months down the line, but also thinking about in the days right after the assessment, what are the odds of having pain flare-ups and stuff like that. So that's kind of my research area, and something that I think it kind of speaks to some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, that on the surface, when you think about pain as a topic in physiotherapy, it seems relatively straightforward. But the moment you look beyond the surface, you realize that there's all these nuances that, although they may seem like almost like semantics, thinking about like reactions to physical activity right away versus later, but it makes a whole lot of difference in your day-to-day management. If you can't get them on board with the physical activity program because of how they react in the moment right away, then you can't get the benefits that you're aiming for down the line. So that's kind of what I'm doing with my PhD.
I'm curious about what other research to practice gaps you've seen.
Mm-hmm. There's always so many areas that are so interesting and that could benefit from more research. But I'll just name maybe another one that I find is really important, and one that I'm working on as a side project with a colleague, and it's trauma-informed care. So the Canadian Pain Task Force report actually highlighted that equity-oriented, trauma-informed, and violence-informed approaches to care are a really important framework for us to operate as clinicians, but also as researchers and educators. And for those who aren't familiar with trauma-informed care, what it essentially refers to is when you're thinking about a patient, or any person out in the community, everyone has their own baggage that you might not be aware of. And that baggage may include some traumatic experiences or near traumatic experiences. It could be in terms of physical abuse. It could be in terms of sexual abuse. It could be in terms of something that happens more at a systemic level or historical level, but still very much affecting your reality. And if we're not careful with how we interact with patients, we can inadvertently re-traumatize patients. We can trigger these past traumas with the things that we do. If we think about physiotherapy and you think of manual therapy or even just how our evaluation process, if you're asking someone to remove a piece of clothing, but they've had a history of sexual abuse, or if you jump into doing some hands-on therapy without providing choice and asking for permission and explaining what you do ahead of time, someone, for example, with physical abuse or torture victims or other abuses might be re-traumatized and triggered by you kind of jumping in there too quickly and not providing enough explanations ahead of time and providing choice and engaging in it with a sense of collaboration. And we think that it's something that's rare or whatever. But in reality, it's quite common, much more common than we think. So there was a study a little over 10 years ago that was focused on these kind of traumatic adverse experiences. And they found that in general, in Canada, 3 out of 4 Canadians would have had at least one traumatic experience in their lifetime. That's 3 out of 4 in the general population. And if we think about the risk factors for developing chronic pain or persistent pain, these kind of early life adverse events are a risk factor. And so you're probably dealing with an even higher prevalence than 3 out of 4. And so it's a really interesting topic. And I realize that I'm going a little too deep into it. Obviously, I'm very interested in it, but it's another interesting way to think about how pain science applies to many areas of practice. If you were doing pelvic floor physiotherapy, for instance, where it's not about trying to directly ask a patient about their trauma and directly intervening on it, because that's really the scope of practice of psychologists. But it's about adopting certain principles in how we interact with patients and how we introduce treatment options and apply them that are least likely to re-traumatize and trigger past traumas. And it comes from a place of recognizing that there's a really high prevalence of Canadians, of people living with a past traumatic experience.
Right. And so I guess I'm also curious about how that gap can be narrowed, because I think trauma-informed care and providing that care to patients takes a lot of skill and learning. So I think we have to be open to that first as physiotherapy students and physiotherapists. But I'm wondering, what can physios and physio students do to help narrow that gap in their application?
Yeah, so for example, if we're on this topic of trauma-informed care, Alberta Health Services have created these series of free e-modules on trauma-informed care. And so you can just go on Google, write Alberta Health Services trauma-informed care e-module, and you can do that for free. And you'll realize that as much as it sounds like special skill or knowledge, you'll kind of realize that you're actually probably already doing a lot of it without realizing that it fits under the category of trauma-informed care, but it just kind of maybe comes from a place of trying to have person-centered care and just general social etiquette, I suppose. But to really kind of take that a little bit further, and although you may be doing some of it, to really kind of become really well-rounded in doing all of the best practices in interaction style that really fosters a sense of safety for the patient and that is least likely to re-trigger anything from their past. And that's really this complexity of recognizing that, it's not only about how it can hurt or help your clinical interaction and the likelihood that they'll come back for a follow-up if we're thinking of a private practice, but also the direct link that early life events, or even doesn't have to be early life, just any moment in life events can have on pain, right? Or your past experiences that have maybe wound up your autonomic nervous system towards being really activated from a sympathetic nervous system standpoint, affecting also kind of your perceptions and your level of sensory sensitization. These are all things that suddenly you realize are all connected together. And it can start from a simple place of adopting principles of interaction and having an awareness that there can be past traumatic experiences and they could be relevant across all these spheres. And this is an area of research that in physiotherapy, but also in general, is relatively new-ish, but really still has a lot of work ahead of it. And so some of the research that I'm working towards as a first step is conducting a survey across all healthcare professionals in Canada who treat people with chronic pain to see the extent to which they're aware of trauma and trauma-informed care, and what are their beliefs and attitudes about it, about implementing in their practice, to what extent are they already doing it, and their willingness to do more of it. And then from there, you can identify what are your facilitators and barriers for any knowledge translation initiatives that you would do to try to get people to do it more. And then after that, you can really go and try to have these kind of widespread continuing education and professional development interventions and tracking the impact it's had in terms of having a a wider implementation across all professions that treat people with pain. So that's kind of some stuff to consider. But there's a lot of areas of research in pain, right? If you think about basic science, so basic science refers to research that's maybe more at the molecular level, maybe using more animal studies to really get a fundamental understanding of what areas of the brain are involved and how are they related to the other parts of the person, and the physiological effects of different pharmacological interventions, but also non-pharmacological interventions, and really kind of better just having a, the more we can understand pain at every level, be it molecular or at animal testing or clinical studies or observational studies or randomized controlled trials, at all levels, the more we can understand pain profoundly, the more it offers us opportunities to either fine-tune our existing interventions so that they're more effective, so that they're more personalized. What I mean by that is thinking about the fact that each patient is different from the next patient and how to personalize that to each person. And so the deeper we understand pain, the more we can either fine-tune our existing interventions or even develop new interventions at all levels, be it pharmacological, invasive stuff, to more physical-based or exercise-based or psychology-based or social-based and so forth.
Yeah, that's very interesting and very important work. I want to ask one more question related to your research. So you mentioned that your PhD revolves around sensitivity to physical activity among those who experience complex pain and potentially chronic pain. And so my question for you is, how will you incorporate what you've learned in that research into a clinical context? Because I know you're also working on private practice as well.
Yeah. So if I take, for example, some of the knowledge that's coming out in recent pain research. So for example, I talked about personalized care. So there's this increasing recognition and distinction between different types of pain, right? You have nociceptive pain, where you have a closer relationship to what you'd think of like nociception as a nerve signal and the amount of and the extent of the pain experience that you'll get. Or you have neuropathic pain, which is really related to damage or disease of nerves. And then you have nociplastic pain, which really relates to an altered physiology or functioning of the pain system and having amplified pain. So if we're thinking of central sensitization, for example, so the usefulness of identifying what seems to be the dominant type of pain, even though you can have more than one at the same time, is that there's certain treatment approaches that work better depending on what is the dominant type of pain. And so that's kind of one example of broader pain research that I would take into consideration, is that you have these algorithms, these flowcharts that can help you identify what seems to be the dominant type of pain. And then if you think about it specifically in the context of prescribing physical activity or exercise as a treatment, there's a lot of research. Some of it is labeled under sensitivity to physical activity, which is what I'm doing. But it also, there's a lot of other terms that relate to it, like exercise-induced hypoalgesia or hyperalgesia, for instance. And what's really interesting when you get involved in that research is that you realize that, okay, let's have this kind of standardized, structured way of evaluating the extent to which someone is sensitized to engaging with movement, with physical activity and exercise. And it helps you with determining for example, the dosage, the intensity of how you start off the exercise program, right? So if you don't take into account that someone is highly sensitized to physical activity, then you might prescribe at a dosage or intensity that's too difficult right off the bat. The person gets a big flare up, and they're like, my physiotherapist just made me worse. And then they don't want to do the exercises anymore. They just leave physiotherapy and they say, oh, I just want to get massages instead. So it allows you to be like, okay, this is the extent to which this person is sensitized. And this is how I can, for example, set the initial intensity or dosage. And also like when you're trying to progress the exercises. But you can also think about it in the extent that, is this like a local sensitized area that's responding, or is it like a widespread sensitization? And thinking about the implications about providing exercises initially, maybe that are indirect to the specific area in pain, and then eventually progressing to doing exercises that directly target the area. Or if someone has like a widespread pain, then there's research showing that starting off in a self-paced manner is better than in a prescribed manner. And so depending on what is the level of sensitivity? How is it expressed? Is it localized? Is it broad? Is it predominantly this kind of situational activity evoked psychological responses that we're trying to mediate, like with cognitive functional therapy? Or are we dealing with this kind of sensitized reactions? And we can start thinking about, okay, cardio versus strength, indirect multi-joint compound exercises versus targeted localized exercise. And do you start off with one, and when do you move on to the next, so that you really mitigate the risks of triggering a flare-up, or conversely, to mitigate the risks of going too easy and not having any effect, right? You want to make sure you push hard enough. And when you engage in this area of research, there's a lot of clinical applications, thinking even just about the fact that when you prescribe physical activity and exercise, you can do it in a way that causes pain, but given maybe certain parameters where the pain increase that happens is tolerable, temporary, and doesn't change the overall recovery trajectory of the person. Where sometimes, when we think about people who have sensitized reactions to physical activity and exercise, we sometimes think that we need to find a way to do movement that causes no increase in pain, that doesn't evoke any pain. But as much as this is something that you can, you want to do for the comfort of your patient, you don't want to go at it too intensely, right? Because if you try at all costs to avoid any sensitized reaction, even if it's temporary and harmless, with activity and movement, then you might be inadvertently implying to the person that they should never move with pain. And so they develop these excessive fears about pain with movement. And whereas in reality, there's systematic review and good research to show that you can work with some pain, that it's not, that you don't need to avoid having pain with movement at all costs. I mean, of course you do what you can so that it's not too unpleasant as an experience for the patient, that it's something that is acceptable and tolerable, and that anything you do is in terms of having pain with movement is temporary and harmless. But you don't need to completely avoid it and then suddenly start passing a message about how someone should be like completely still and sedentary when they have pain, because oh no, don't you go and start moving and causing pain. And some of that is really rooted in stuff that we talked about earlier, that sometimes there's this belief that any amount of pain we feel is always an indication of damage, and so we should avoid it. But that's not necessarily true. You could have pain without damage, and that's why it's acceptable to do activity and rehab exercises with pain.
Right. There's a lot of considerations when it comes to working with pain, chronic pain or complex pain. And it'll be interesting to have you on after, let's say, a year of your practice in your chronic pain clinic and see how have you helped your patients. I think we've covered a lot of grounds, and it's so great to hear, because you have a very unique perspective as a clinician researcher and also as a person who is highly involved in pain science and pain science advocacy. How do our audience learn more about the work that you're doing, the chronic pain clinic that you are opening, and get in touch with more of the things that, for example, your research as well?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie and Reina. So as I'm seeing the light at the end of the tunnel being my PhD, I'm gearing up towards the next phase in my career. And so as I'm winding down my PhD, I'm in the process of launching my own clinic, the Chronic Pain Rehab Clinic. And so if you want to learn more about me or get in touch with me within the next few weeks or so, or next month, I should be finalizing my website, www.chronicpainrehab.ca. You can get in touch with me through there, or my social media handle at Chronic Pain Rehab. And so right now, probably if you go there right now, it's all like sort of under construction or not really available. But within the next few weeks or next month or so, that will be a way for you to be able to get in touch with me. And as I start posting stuff, the knowledge that I want to share and my perspective.
Great. Thank you. Do you have any final things that you want to cover, want to say to our audience?
I would say look us up, look up the Pain Science Division. If you're listening to this through Spotify, look up the description, and you should find some links to learn more about the pain science division. You can look at our professional development tool, the painscience.ca. Look us up, become one of our numbers, right? Sometimes people say, I don't want to be a number, but I'm encouraging you to be a member. If you pay the $35 annual fee to be a pain science division member, then we have more members, and then we have a stronger voice in our advocacy. But you'll also benefit from everything that we offer in terms of webinars and podcasts and mentorship programs and pain science practice discussion groups and networking and all the efforts we're doing to do knowledge translation and so on and so forth, which you've heard about a ton today. So I encourage you to look us up, reach out to us, reach out to Tiffany, reach out to Reina, reach out to me, reach out to anyone at the Pain Science Division. We'd be more than happy to talk to you.
Amazing. And if you enjoyed listening to this episode, give our podcast a rating, great rating. It will help us with the algorithms and all that. And make sure you spread your word to your fellow physios and physio students and anyone interested in pain science. Thank you so much, Arthur, for spending time with us and talk so much about pain science. And I wish you all the best with your PhD and opening up for your chronic pain clinic. And to our audience, all the best to you as well.